Sami Hamdi is editor-in-chief of the International Interest, who joins us from London. We also have Marcus Papadopoulos, author and historian, also joining us from London. Welcome to you both. Sami Hamdi, let me first start with you. The censorship that is taking place, Twitter has been one of the platforms that has been cited to have censored the news coming out, especially the violence that we have seen in the occupied territories, in particular the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. Why do you think Twitter has decided to censor that?
I think it's important to stress how these events tend to take place, which is that the news tends to come out, and then the groups that are sympathetic towards Israel essentially start reporting all content in a bid to try to get it removed. And if you imagine the number of sudden reporting that these social media companies get from these very organized groups that are dedicated to ensuring the stifling of all opinions that are against the Israeli expansion, against the Israeli occupation. The reality is that when you compare the organization of these groups towards the organization of groups that are committed to the liberation of Palestine, you see that, quite frankly, that they are far more influential, far more capable of lobbying, far more capable of exerting that sort of influence. So if you imagine if you're an operator or moderator at Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, and you're seeing hundreds and thousands of reporting of opinions that are not necessarily aligned with what you want, or essentially discussing what is happening in the Sheikh Jarrah, or that is happening in the Aqsa Mosque last night, the automatic reaction of these social media companies is to suspend those. The reason why I emphasize on this point specifically is that it's important to highlight and to be, or rather acknowledge that the news is still coming out. We are still hearing the news on social media platforms, and that this time, which with Sheikh Jarrah and with the Aqsa Mosque, the stream of information is so large by those who are seeking to defend Sheikh Jarrah that quite simply the social media accounts cannot viably cancel or stifle all of those particular opinions. But I do think the blame, or rather the primary reason, is the effective organization of pro-Israeli groups.
Well, I'm looking at the latest Marcus Papadopoulos, who have come out from the clashes taking place at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, and 205 Palestinians have been injured, including 17 Israeli forces. These clashes are pretty rough and severe. They started in the beginning of the holy month of Ramadan. Is this time around, however, different, looking at the way that the violence has unfolded?
No, I don't believe so whatsoever. Year on year, we see the Palestinian people being subjected to some of the most horrific abuses that the world has seen in recent times. And no matter how great the suffering of the Palestinian people is, the reality, the harsh reality, is that might is right. Israel has the might. Israel is backed by both America and Britain. Washington and London, year on year, give blank checks to Israel to do as they please. So it doesn't matter how, on this occasion, the Palestinians again have had their human rights terribly violated. The reality is that the Israelis are backed by the Americans and the British, and with that, the future for the Palestinians is bleak. But I certainly want to comment on the censorship of Palestinian accounts, and I want to approach this from a somewhat different perspective, because whilst I understand the indignation of those Palestinians on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram who have found their accounts to either have been deleted or suspended, such a feeling is both futile and illogical. Now, why do I say that? Because Instagram, Facebook and Twitter are neither free nor impartial. They are weapons of the American state, which the American state uses to pursue and further its agenda, both at home and abroad. And that agenda, largely speaking, is a neoliberal one. So if we take Facebook, for instance, Mark Zuckerberg did not make Facebook a global phenomenon by himself. No. Someone from the American apparatus of power approached him and opened doors for him. So we have to understand that if you are sympathetic to the Palestinians, if you are sympathetic to Iranian foreign policy, and you are on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, you are on enemy territory. And it is simply pointless to complain or to moan. What we need are viable equivalents to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So, for example, there is the social media platform Parler, but we need more of those. In short, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram are not our friends. They are not the friends of the Palestinians. They are not the friends of the Syrians. They are weapons of the American state and also the British state. So, once again, whilst I understand the anger and frustration of those Palestinians, those Palestinians and all of us have to understand a very brutal reality that Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram are hostile opponents to those who support the Palestinians. And indeed, even those who profess a love of God, even those who profess a love of their history, culture, and values, those who believe that there are only two genders in the world, the male and female ones, are also subjected to censorship. Why? Because the three aforementioned social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, are neoliberal weapons of the American state and also the British state.
Okay, and let me ask you, Sami Hamdi. You know, it's the same question really regarding the types of violence that we're seeing there. It's pretty severe, and I'm curious, given the fact that you obviously have Palestinians to, aside from this month, to be really oppressed overall, restricted, and their rights being violated. Do you think that this may lead to any kind of an intifada?
I think it's important to look at the context within which these events are taking place. Turkey has announced a new ambassador to Israel, and it's invited the Israeli energy minister to Turkey next month in a bid to restore ties and secure some sort of rapprochement. Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia is continuing the drive for normalization in allowing Israeli teams to participate under the Israeli flag in Saudi tournaments that it's hosting and on Saudi Arabia territory. The UAE, it's unlikely to affect ties with the UAE, and all of the Muslim nations have come out with statements from their foreign ministries as opposed to their state leaders in what is being seen as standard protocol as opposed to any effective action. And this is because Tel Aviv is convinced that there will be no repercussions for its actions that are taking place. If we're looking at it specifically from the Palestinian perspective and whether there's a possible intifada, let's suppose that there is an intifada, let's suppose that there is an uprising of the Palestinians. The reality is that the Fatah Mahmoud Abbas, fearing he would lose the Palestinian elections, had decided to delay it. There is strife now again between Hamas and the other Palestinian factions. They're unable to unite between one another. So let's suppose that there is an intifada. Let's suppose the Palestinians riot. Let's suppose that they cause a chaos. We're not expecting the Americans to swing in, to sweep in, to suddenly help the Palestinians, nor Europe, nor the Muslim countries, nor anyone for that matter. So if an intifada is happening, then we'll see bloodshed and then a return to the status quo. And if an intifada doesn't happen, then Israel at least expects that Turkey will continue the rapprochement process, bin Salman will continue the drive for normalization, the UAE will continue to maintain its ties, Egypt will continue to give lip service, and this is the reason why there is a sense of the futility of the situation. I think the most important gain or the most important advantage for the Palestinians as a result of these events is perhaps the increased awareness over the issue, the increased sense of Israel brutality towards the Palestinians in a manner that is suddenly being more appreciated. These videos that are coming out of bombs being thrown at worshippers, the reality is that when you look at social media accounts, when you look at the reaction of people generally, even those who are pro-Israel are beginning to express discomfort over the tactics that Israel is using against the Palestinians. And Israel is making it increasingly difficult for its allies to continue to publicly support it. And I think in this regard, whilst it may not be considered a sizable advantage in the case of the Palestinians, I do think that these events are beginning to give traction to the Palestinian narrative in the conflict that might lead to a more considered approach towards this idea of a two-state solution, which I personally believe is an injustice in and of itself. It's merely recognizing some territory as opposed to all territory being stolen. However, as I said, I think in the context, Israel believes it's acting with impunity, but that should not discount the benefits of bringing to light or bringing to the global attention the oppression of the Palestinians and seeing the reaction and outcry on the part of people who were not necessarily outraged before. I think this is something positive and something to be welcomed.
Thank you for that, Sami Hamdi, Editor-in-Chief of the International Interest, and thank you, Marcus Papadopoulos, author and historian.